Welcome, book lovers, storytellers, and seekers of passion and truth. I'm Scarlet Ibis James, and today I have something special for you. A reading from my short story collection, Scarlet Yearnings, Stories of Love and Desire. In this segment, I'll be sharing I Love My Husband, But, a story that peels back the layers of longing, commitment, and the quiet complexities of love. But that's not all. Following my reading, I'm honored to be joined by the incredible Kym Dominique-Ferguson, a poet by birth, a theater performer and filmmaker by training, and a producer by nurture. The Jamaican, Haitian, Trinidadian lends his unique voice to my story. I love my wife, but an answer to the first reading and an excerpt from my upcoming short story collection. Together, these two stories create a powerful dialogue about love, desire, and soulmates tethered in continually morphing relationship. So settle in, listen closely, and let's explore the heart of what it means to love. I love my husband, but Miss Shields' modest home smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee. The sun streamed through half-open blinds, casting slanted rays on the hardwood floor of the living room. Amy Rees sat upright on the edge of the couch, her gaze moved from the overflowing bookshelf of worn classics to the family pictures on the mantel. They showed kids with wide-toothed smiles and a man with kind eyes wearing a plain work shirt. "Thank you for inviting me, Miss Shields," Amy said, smoothing out her skirt. Her voice carried the polite stiffness of someone out of their element. Miss Shields poured coffee into two mismatched mugs, setting one in front of Amy. "Please call me Cynthia. We're not in school." Amy smiled and nodded, taking a careful sip of the coffee. It was bitter, but she kept drinking. Miss Shields settled into the armchair across from her, the teacher's familiar authoritative aura softened by the comfort of her own home. They talked about everything and nothing. Poetry and politics, the latest novels, the tediousness of teenage drama. "I'm going to work at the bank after graduation, Miss Shields. They've already offered me a teleposition. I'll save some money and take a year off before I start at the University of the West Indies." Amy's chest swelled as she outlined her plan. Her eyes gleamed with excitement, and her smile was wide and toothy. But Miss Shields leaned forward, eyes sharp and severe now. "Amy, you're brilliant. You have the kind of mind that doesn't come along often, and I want you to hear me on this." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "Go straight to college. Don't take a year off. That year turns into 10 before you know it." Amy nodded, absorbing the weight of the teacher's words. "Number 2, Miss Shields continued, her voice unwavering, "don't marry until you've achieved all the education you desire. You deserve to focus on yourself first." Amy's eyes flickered with respect and curiosity as though she saw her teacher in a new light. "And the third thing," Miss Shields glanced at the photos on the mantel, then back to Amy. "Marry someone on the same economic level as you, or higher. I love my husband, but to take our children to Disney, we must save for years. If we were on the same income level or if his was higher, things would be different." Amy didn't speak, just nodded again. The advice felt heavy, as though it was meant to guide her through an invisible maze she couldn't yet see. She glanced at the coffee, then at Miss Shields. The tiny lines at the corner of the teacher's eyes caught her attention. "I understand," Amy said, and she meant it. 30 years later. Amy stared out the window of her small, well-loved kitchen. The sink was empty, and the clock on the wall ticked steadily. Faint cartoon sounds came from the living room, where her youngest was sprawled on the couch. Her husband, Jim, was hunched over the dining table, scribbling in a notebook. He looked up, offering a tired smile. Amy had taken none of Miss Shields' advice. She had taken a year off that became a decade, then two. At 41, she had completed her master's degree. She pieced it together through night classes and online classes, courses between shifts and parent-teacher meetings. She married Jim, a man with a high school diploma, just like herself back then. He was kind, steady, reliable. But she was sure this wasn't what Miss Shield meant. During their marriage, the income gap widened. Jim's job paid what it always had. Amy's degrees raised her salary, but travel was still limited to road trips and camping. The dream vacation to Singapore remained just that, a dream for another year or more. She loved Jim, no question. He was a good father, her unwavering supporter. But she couldn't shake the quiet, persistent, what if? What if she had followed Mrs. Shields' advice? What if she had finished school earlier? What if they were on the same financial footing? Would it have made the difference she imagined? Amy stepped away from the window, picking up a dish towel to dry her hands. She glanced at Jim, now deep in concentration, and she felt that familiar mix of affection and resignation. Life was what it was. She had chosen this every step of the way. As she watched her husband scribble numbers in his notebook, she heard Mrs. Shields' clear, confident voice advising her on that long ago Saturday morning. Amy, I love my husband, but... Over to you, Kym.
Sitting there in the car now, staring at the house they'd built together, Jim felt the familiar pang of something he didn't let himself name too often. Regret? Maybe. But it wasn't as simple as wishing. He'd chosen a different path. He loved Amy. He loved their children, Janet, who was off to college, and Jazz, who was in high school. And he knew he'd made the right choice for them. Still, some nights, he couldn't help but wonder what Mr. Knight would think if he could see him now, wearing the suit and tie, shuffling through spreadsheets, a practical man to his core. Jim let out a breath and turned off the engine. The house was waiting. Amy was waiting. Whatever fire he'd left behind in that art room all those years ago, he'd channeled into them instead. And most days, that was enough. Most days. Inside, the smell of her cooking, something with garlic, maybe onions, hit him before he saw her. Sure enough, she was at the table, papers spread out, glasses perched on her nose. She didn't look up right away when he walked in. "You're late," she said, still marking something in red pen. "Perry needed me to clean up his numbers again," Jim said, hanging his coat on the rack. Pitch was off by 3 zeros. She snorted, finally looking at Evan. "And let me guess, he's going to get the credit." Jim shrugged, loosening his tie. "Perry always does." Amy smiled faintly, but her eyes lingered on him for a moment, taking him in like she was trying to read more than he was saying. He didn't offer anything else. He didn't need to. He assumed she already knew how it went. "How was your day?" he asked, slipping into the chair across from her. "Busy," she said, "but good. I got one of the kids' essays here. Brilliant writer. She's got potential." He reached for the glass of water she'd set out for him. She always did, even though he never asked. "How's she doing?" "She's struggling," Amy said, pushing her papers aside to face him fully. "Her parents don't see the point in her writing. They want her to focus on something more practical." Jim nodded, taking a sip of water. "Sounds familiar." Amy tilted her head, studying him. What do you mean? He gave her a small, weary smile. Just that I get it. Not everyone gets to follow their dreams. Her gaze lingered on him, and with a deliberate breath, she released the tension in her brow, her eyes softening as though she decided to set the argument aside. Her jaw unclenched, and the faintest shift in her lips hinted at a quiet effort to let go, smoothing her expression into something gentler. Jim observed his wife's intentional relaxation exercise. Those yoga and meditation classes work, he thought with a touch of snark. He continued to examine her beautiful, dark-skinned face, tracing the familiar curve of her high cheekbones framed by a strong, graceful profile. Faint laugh lines softened the edges of her seriousness, adding a quiet warmth to her focused expression. He wasn't even sure why he was staring so intently, lost somewhere between admiration and exhaustion, when her head tilted slightly and her eyes locked onto his. Caught. His thoughts stumbled over themselves, a tinge of heat rising to his fair-skinned face, inherited from the indigenous side of his heritage. She arched a brow, her thick lips curving into the faintest hint of a smirk, a silent acknowledgment that she'd caught him in the act and was patiently waiting for him to say something. But his mind went utterly blank. She looked like she might say something for a moment, but then her lips parted briefly before pressing together again. The words left unsaid. Instead, she reached out and rested her hand on his. You work too hard, Jim. Someone's got to, he said lightly, though the words settled heavy in the air. She didn't let go of his hand. You know you don't have to keep doing this forever, right? There's more to life than this. He glanced at her, then down at her hands. Her fingers were delicate and warm. He tried to muster a grin. What should I do, Amy? Start a fruit truck? I can see it now. Jim's Gourmet PB&Js. I'd be the toast of the town. Amy's lips twitched, but she didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice steady and unyielding. No, Jim. I'm serious. Maybe you stop waiting for someone to hand you something better and take it. Jim didn't respond right away. He'd heard her say things like this before, and it always sounded so easy when it came out of her mouth. She was bold like that. He loved it about her, but sometimes it felt like they lived in two different words. Yeah, he said finally, the word hanging between them. She looked at him for a moment, and her pen still in her hand. Jim, you're too good at this job to be stuck where you are. You should have let him flounder. Maybe then they'd see how much they need you. Jim shrugged and stood, heading toward the fridge. Doesn't work like that, Amy. It could if you stopped holding yourself back, she said, her voice sharper now. He froze for a second, his hand on the fridge. Holding myself back? You could be running that department by now if you wanted to, Amy said, setting her pen down. I'm not saying it would be easy, but don't you want more for us, for our children, to see their dad not just surviving but thriving? The money's fine, but it could be better. You could be better. Better? The word hit him like a slap. Jim's chest tightened and he stared at his muted reflection on the fridge, trying to process what she just said. I love my wife, but she doesn't understand what she's saying. She can't grasp what it takes to navigate the corporate work and social spaces every day, the silencing, the endurance, the constant code switching, all to keep our life as steady as it is. Jim turned to face her, exhaustion spilling into his tone. And risk what? This? He gestured vaguely at the house, his voice sharp with frustration. He wanted to say, everything will work for. You don't know what it's like, Amy, always being the one to prove he belongs, working 3 times as hard to stay safe, respectable, and remain employed. But he kept the words locked inside, pressing them into the back of his mind where they couldn't do any harm. He glanced at her instead, at the quiet determination in her eyes, and felt the tension in his chest ease just a little. He hated arguments, They solved nothing, only created cracks where they didn't need to be any. He'd grown up in a house where arguments between his mom and his parade of stepdads were the soundtrack of his childhood. That wasn't going to be my son's story. So, forgetting he had not opened the fridge, he sighed and returned to the family dining table. You're right, he said, trying to keep any sign of condescending out of his tone. Maybe I should think about it. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. It was the kind of middle ground that had gotten them through plenty of conversations like this before. The compromise he could live with tonight. She tilted her head, observing him, and he could tell she wasn't fooled. I understand exactly what you mean when you say you'll think about it, she said, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. But you deserve more than this. We do. Jim pressed his lips together, saying nothing. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was the easiest way through moments like this. If he stayed quiet long enough, Amy would carry on pouring her thoughts into the room until she felt heard. Tonight, though, her pause lingered, the space between them filled with the quiet weight of unspoken truths. You don't think I see it? You think I don't see it? She added finally firmly. But I see it. You're tired, Jim. The passion has been draining from you for a long time, and I love you too much to pretend I don't understand. After a few more beats of silence, she smiled. Go wash up. Dinner's ready. Jim stood, kissed her on the top of her head, and headed to the bathroom. As he scrubbed his hands, Jim stared at his reflection again. The same tired eyes stared back at him. Amy's words lingered in his mind, settling places he hadn't let himself explore in years. She wasn't wrong. He was exhausted. And maybe he'd been so focused on keeping everything steady that he'd forgotten how much Amy cared about more than just stability. She wanted joy, adventure, something they could dream of and work on together. When he returned to the dining room, Amy was setting plates on the table, the delicious smell of the brown stewed chicken filling the air. Jim hesitated for a moment, then cleared his throat. Amy, what if we started planning that vacation, the one we always talk about? She blinked, caught off guard. What vacation? Jim sat at the head of the table, leaning back slightly as Amy moved around the dining room. She was still setting out dishes, her movements practiced but absent-minded as if her thoughts were elsewhere. You know, he said in his casual tone, Singapore, the street food, the skyline, that infinity pool you're always looking at in travel blogs. Amy paused, serving a platter of brown rice in her hands, and turned to face him, her brow furrowing. What about it? Let's do it, Jim said, the words coming easier than he expected. Let's actually make it happen. Amy blinked, caught off guard, and for a moment she just stood there. Then almost instinctively she placed a dish of candied carrots on the table and sank into the chair across from him. You serious? She asked, searching his face. Jim nodded and a small grin tugging at his lips. Yes, I am. Let's plan the trip. It's about time, don't you think? Before Amy could answer, Jim turned toward the living room where the faint sound effects of a video game floated through the air. Jazz, dinner's ready. Come on, let's eat. Just a second, Jazz called back, his voice distracted. Not a second, Jim replied, his voice firm but playful. Right now, bud. I've got important travel plans to discuss with your mom, and you're part of them. Hurried footsteps followed, and Jazz appeared in the hallway, in the doorway, controller in hand. Travel plans? Where are we going? Jim glanced at Amy. He was happy to see her expression, which was a mix of surprise and joy, her lips beginning to curve into a smile. We'll tell you over dinner, he said, turning back to Jazz. Now, sit down before the food gets cold. You're not going to want to miss this. Jazz slid into his seat, his curiosity lighting up the room. while Amy finally let out a tentative laugh and shook her head, her eyes still fixed on Jim. You're really serious about this? As serious as I've ever been, Jim said, his tone steady, meeting her gaze. Let's make it one. Amy's eyes widened, and for a moment she just stared at him. Then her lips curved into a smile, genuine, warm, and just a little disbelieving. Are you serious? She asked again. Yes, yes, he said, meeting her gaze. We deserve it. You said it yourself. We deserve more than this. Let's give ourselves something to look forward to, something to work toward. We can time it around Janet's summer break. Amy laughed, a sound that filled the room and made Jim feel lighter than he had in weeks. You're not going to back out on me this time. Not a chance, he said with a slight grin. You can hold me to it. Pushing her chair back, she walked over to him and leaned down, cupping his face in her hands. I will, she whispered, her forehead resting against his for a moment. And I love you for this. I love you too. Scarlet Ibis James, 2024, all rights reserved.
Enjoyed this reading, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story.